What's up guys, Yojimbo here, and we have our next video for Diablo 4. Today we're not covering any sort of a drama happening in the community, as it's been actually pretty quiet lately, but what we do want to cover here is something to help the new players, or maybe even players who just haven't found this information out and maybe are struggling with being able to deal a bit of damage in the game. Because let's be honest, the game does not explain this stuff to you anywhere, and you have to consult outside sources to be able to figure this stuff out. Now, coming from a game like Path of Exile, this isn't that big of a deal. I'm very used to that. You have to figure out almost everything in Path of Exile from a third-party source. So we're here today to at least get the basics and bare bones down for you guys to be able to start dealing damage in the game and hopefully be able to progress up to your next world tier, or maybe up to your Lilith fight, your Echo of Lilith fight. If you guys don't know, that's a pinnacle boss called Uber Lilith, and she is a level 100 fight. That is the end goal for most players, and if you want to do that, you're definitely going to need to take advantage of some of these tips here. So what we have is our character here in Diablo 4. You see we are on a 82 Druid, and you can see that we currently have no attack power, even though we have a level 9 Tornado. Now, if you've played most ARPGs, if you're coming from Diablo 2, you would know that this just isn't possible. If you're putting points into your skills, that means you can do damage, but that's not the way it works in Diablo 4. And the reason for that is all of your damage, the base of your damage, is based off of your weapons alone. Now, whether you're using a one-handed weapon and an offhand, call it offensive offhand weapon, such as a totem, or you're using a one-handed weapon and a shield, or you're using a two-handed weapon, it's all going to be percentages based off the weapon damage. So you'll see here, if we put on just our weapon alone, suddenly we're going to be doing 1.9 to 2.3k damage. And if we put on our secondary, we're going to go up to 3.9 to 4.8k damage with our Tornado. The reason for this is that the skills all do a percentage of your weapon damage or your attack power as your damage for your skills. You can see here, as we've leveled up Tornado, it's currently level 9. That means we do 63% of our weapon power as our damage for Tornado, and that's going to be different for every skill. Wind Shear, being at only level 1 as our generator, is going to be 17%. Grizzly Rage is a ultimate ability. It's not dealing damage as much as giving us buffs. Bloodhowl, obviously not dealing damage. Cyclone Armor is dealing damage when we activate it at 30% of our weapon damage at level 1. And then Hurricane, also at level 1, doing 97%. And while that number does seem like it's pretty high compared to the rest of the skills, it is over 9 seconds. So you want to divide that by 9 to see what your damage per second would be, which is obviously not going to be very high. The reason why people are so confused about how they're dealing their damage on here is going to be they'll have something. Let's see if I have one. I don't actually have a great example here of a bad weapon, which I guess is a good thing for me. But they'll have a item that has a lot of what looks like multipliers on them, but they're actually all additive damage increases. And if you're new to ARPGs, that might not make any sense to you. But in ARPGs, it's very commonplace that there are stat lines on your gear, mostly on your weapons, that would be additive damage, and then there's some that are multiplicative damages. In a lot of ARPGs, this is indicated by increased and more. So increased would be additive damages, where multiplicative damages would be described as more damage. They do that a little bit in Diablo 4, but what they use is a plus sign and an X for multiplicative. And it's kind of hard to tell the difference, especially if you don't know that you're looking for the difference in the gear. What we do have is a spreadsheet, though. Yes, we have a spreadsheet. A classic spreadsheet. So this here is going to tell us, I'll do this so you guys can see it. this here is going to tell us all of the different, we call them damage buckets in Diablo 4. And you can see that the main formula for doing your damage, for figuring out your damage here, is going to be, starting out obviously with your weapon damage, right? And then it's going to be your main stat, your big bucket of all of the additives, which is going to be all of these grays here. And then it's going to be your vulnerable, your crit damage, and global multipliers that you get from aspects that have the X on them, or your glyph bonuses. So all of these damages here, if you have too many of them, they eventually start equating to nothing. And that's the problem, is you might have a weapon that has 50% versus elites, 50% versus poisoned, 50% while you're fortified, and 50% while you're a werebear. And you're like, okay, well, I got 4 really high damage modifiers, but for some reason your damage did not go up significantly when you equip that weapon. And the reason for that is these are all being added together and then put against your damage, as opposed to if you had willpower, if you had crit damage, if you had damage versus elites, and you had vulnerable damage as your 4. Now all of these are being multiplied against each other, and it becomes a much higher damage number. And we can go through and do the math on this also. So let's get our D4 back up here. Actually, it might be easier if we look at it with the spreadsheet, so that way you guys can see kind of what we're looking at here. So I'm going to click back and forth. We have our handy dandy little calculator here. So let's just say, like in our first scenario, let's just say you're doing 1,000 base damage, and you have 4 modifiers that are in this gray bucket for 50% each, right? 50 times 4 is going to be 200. So you're going to be times 2 here. Right? And that's going to be a pretty easy one, right? So you have 200% increased damage by all of your multipliers that you have in gray on your weapon. So you're doing 1,000 base damage, and you're just going to be multiplying that by 2 for 200% increased damage. That gives you 2,000, right? Very, very simple math there. Now, if you do it the second way that we described, where you have 1,000 base damage, and let's say you have a 50% increase, here, you have a 50% increase from your crit, you have a 50% increase versus elites, and you have a 50% increase versus vulnerable enemies, right, in its own little bucket down here. And we can see, what our math is going to be with that. So we start out with our 1,000 base damage, and we're going to do 1.5 for our percent multiplied damage in that very first row. Then we're going to do times 1.5 for our crit damage. And we're going to do our times 1.5 for our elite damage. And then we're going to do our times 1.5 for the enemy being vulnerable, right? So we have the same percentages of damage increases, right? It was 200% for both of those scenarios. But in the first scenario, they were all in the same damage bucket. And in the second scenario, they were all coming from their individual damage bucket. And the difference is over 3,000 damage, right? In our first scenario, we came out with a total of 2,000 damage. In our second scenario, we're coming out with a total of 5,062.5 damage. And this is all just because of the multipliers that you decided to have on your gear. So not all of these multipliers are created equally. You'll see here, there's even this X percent damage in its own bucket, not to be confused with plus percent damage right here in its own bucket. The only thing that's not really described here is damage over time, and I'm going to assume that that has its own multiplier, but don't quote me on that one, as damage over time is often pretty wonky in these different scenarios. So if you take a look at my weapon here, you're going to see that I'm trying to take care of all of these different buckets the best way that I can. So we do have willpower, which is in its own bucket. Every character has their own main stat, which is a multiplier to their damage, right? So we are a druid. We use willpower. So that means it is giving us a 50.8% increased skill damage. So we have willpower, which is its own bucket. We have vulnerable, that is its own bucket. And then we have critical strike damage with werewolf skills and critical strike damage. Those two are in the same bucket. So those two I'm not getting another multiplier on, but that's a part of the item upgrades. So that lets me know what I need to look for going forward on another weapon or trying to reroll this weapon. Unfortunately, I've rerolled it quite a few times, and unfortunately, it's very expensive to reroll now. But when I'm looking for a weapon upgrade, so I'm going to be looking for something that has a higher base damage than this currently, and hopefully would have 4 different buckets of damage on it. The same thing is going to go for my offhand. The same thing you want to do for your rings, for your amulet. Anything else that can have a damage modifier on it, you want to make sure that you're not stacking too much of the same bucket of damage. And you can use this graph if you need it. I'll link it down in the comments, or I'll link it down in the description rather, so that way everybody can have it. And you want to just consult this for your class specifically. You'll see they have Sorceress, Rogue, Necro, Druid, Barbarian. It's not going to be very different for these. But you want to make sure you're consulting this and make sure you're spreading out your modifiers in all of these different buckets the best that you can. Obviously, you want to try to get the least amount of these buckets as possible, the ones in the gray. Vulnerable and crit being the two best, right? And just flat percent increase, or flat percent multiplied damage as another one. These are going to be your biggest bonuses. Don't neglect your main stat. And also remember that mathematically attack speed is not a direct damage increase, but it is altering how many attacks you can do per second, which is a essentially multiplicative attack bonus, bonus to your damage. So definitely don't neglect your attack speed. It's very, very important, and it can be one of the modifiers that are going to multiply your damage the fastest, especially if you don't currently have any attack speed. It's going to be extremely noticeable the more you get of it. It does taper off, eventually. It's harder to get more and more and more of it, but you definitely want to make sure you get some to start with. So guys, that is that's the difference there. You definitely want to make sure you're getting into all these different buckets. And again, it doesn't tell you this in the game, so you do want to make sure that you are having some of these outside resources to figure these things out, so that way you can make sure you are getting the most out of your character. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up in the comments. Feel free to find me on the stream over on Twitch. We have a Discord. We have the whole thing. And I'm here to help whenever I can for anybody I can. So guys, hey, if you liked the video, make sure you hit the like and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys all in the next one. Adios, muchachos.